Daniel Brooks thought he'd buried his past deep enough to bring a new wife to a room full of powerful strangers. He was wrong about the room. He was wrong about the strangers. And he was about to be very, very wrong about who was watching him from across it. If you believe the truth always finds a way back into the room, no matter how carefully someone rewrites their past, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Only people siding with liars and vanishing acts will scroll past this one. Stay with me. Amara's story is just getting started. The Grand Annual Ballroom smelled like money, the specific, cold kind that comes from flowers flown in overnight and champagne priced higher than most people's rent. Daniel Brooks adjusted his cufflinks for the third time in 10 minutes, not because they needed adjusting, but because his hands needed something to do besides shake. Tonight mattered. Tonight was the room where his name stopped being the guy who got lucky with an app and started being the man you called first. Investors, senators, a studio head who'd once kept him waiting 40 minutes and would now, Daniel suspected, remember his face. "You look nervous," Priya said, sliding her arm through his. She wore a gown the color of good wine, the kind of dress that made photographers pause without quite knowing why. She'd married a success story. Tonight was supposed to be proof of that. A live demonstration, in real time, for a room full of people who mattered. "I'm not nervous," Daniel said. "I'm focused." It was a lie, and not even a good one. Rooms like this made him feel the way he'd felt at 26, standing outside a life he hadn't earned yet, waiting for someone to check his ID and tell him to leave. He'd spent years constructing a version of himself sturdy enough to survive rooms like this. Tonight would tell him if the construction held. He'd rehearsed his stories in the car, the scrappy years, the all-nighters, the sacrifice narrative that made founders sound like war veterans instead of men who'd simply gotten a check at the right moment. It was a good story. It had one hole in it, carefully patched over. A name he never said out loud anymore. A chapter he'd edited out so cleanly that even he sometimes forgot it had been real. He didn't expect the past to have a seating chart tonight. The gala buzzed around him in layers. String quartet under the low murmur of networking. Laughter performed at exactly the volume required to be noticed. Daniel guided Priya through introductions, felt the familiar high of being recognized, watched people's eyes flick to his watch, his suit, the size of the room he now belonged in. And then, for reasons he couldn't explain, the back of his neck went cold. He turned before he understood why. Across the ballroom, near the tall windows, stood a woman in a midnight blue gown, half turned away, laughing softly at something someone had said. He couldn't see her face. He didn't need to. Something in the line of her shoulders, the particular way she held her glass without really drinking from it, sent a jolt of recognition through him, so sharp it felt physical. No, he thought. It can't be. He told himself it was nothing. A trick of lighting. A stranger who moved like someone he used to know. He turned back to Priya, to the senator mid-anecdote, to the version of the night he'd planned. But his pulse hadn't gotten the message. It kept knocking, insistent, low in his throat. Then the room shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Not at first. Just a change in air pressure, the way a room feels different half a second before a storm breaks. Conversations dimmed by degrees, heads turning one after another like dominoes deciding to fall. Daniel followed the tilt of attention toward the entrance and felt something in his chest drop before his brain caught up to why. Security first. Four men who moved like they were paid to notice things other people missed. Then him. A man in a suit that didn't shout money because it didn't have to, flanked by silence instead of noise. Walking into the ballroom like he already knew exactly where he was going. Daniel didn't recognize him. Not yet, but he recognized the way people made room. The particular hush reserved for men whose power nobody needed explained to them twice. The stranger crossed the room without looking left or right, without pausing for the senator who half rose to greet him, without acknowledging the studio head who visibly straightened his jacket. He was walking towards something. Someone. Daniel followed the line of his path and felt the champagne go warm in his hand. He was walking toward the woman in midnight blue. "Daniel?" Priya's voice, somewhere far away. "You've gone pale. What's wrong?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the woman was turning now, finally, toward the man crossing the ballroom for her. And Daniel Brooks, for the first time in 6 years, was about to see a face he'd spent that entire time pretending he'd forgotten. Priya's grip on his arm tightened, but Daniel barely felt it. His entire world had narrowed to the space between himself and the woman in midnight blue, now turning toward the man crossing the ballroom like the two of them were the only people in it. Amara. The name surfaced in his mind before he could stop it, dragging 6 years of carefully buried memory up with it. Her laugh, sharp and real. Nothing like the practiced titters filling this room. Her hands, ink-stained from grading paper she wasn't paid enough to grade, before she traded that life for one stitched together out of grant applications and stubbornness. The morning he'd left, the note he told himself was kind. She looked older. She looked better, which felt like a personal insult, as if she'd taken his absence and turned it into fuel instead of grief. The stranger reached her. Daniel watched, along with, it seemed, every other set of eyes in the ballroom, as the man lifted Amara's hand with a gentleness that looked less like a greeting and more like a ritual he'd performed 1,000 times in his mind and only now, finally, got to perform for real. He said something. Daniel was too far away to hear it, but he watched Amara's face change. Surprise first, then something softer, something that looked dangerously close to relief. Then the man kissed her. Not a social kiss, not the practiced cheek brush of gala etiquette. His mouth found hers slow and certain, unhurried by the 300 witnesses suddenly holding their breath around them. It was the kind of kiss that didn't ask the room for permission because it had never occurred to the man that the room's opinion mattered. Somewhere behind Daniel, a champagne flute hit the floor and shattered. Nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody moved at all. Daniel? Priya's whisper had an edge now, real alarm cutting through her earlier curiosity. Who is that man? Why is everyone staring like, I don't know, Daniel said, which was half true. He didn't know the man's name, but some animal part of his brain, the part that had once negotiated funding rounds by reading a room in 3 seconds flat, already understood something crucial. Whoever this stranger was, he did not belong to the category of ordinary rich man. Ordinary rich men did not make senators rise halfway out of their seats without a word. Ordinary rich men did not walk into a room and rearrange its gravity. A woman nearby, silver-haired, dripping in old money jewelry, leaned toward her companion, her whisper pitched just loud enough to travel. That's Kang Min Jae. The name rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Daniel watched it move across the ballroom face by face, watched recognition dawn in people who clearly knew exactly who that was, even if Daniel didn't. Watched the studio head go pale. Watched the senator's aide reach for his phone with the panicked energy of a man about to cancel several very important calls. The shipping billionaire? Someone murmured. I thought he didn't do public events. He doesn't, came the reply, hushed and thrilled in the specific way people get when gossip promises to be extraordinary. I heard he hasn't been photographed at a gala in 4 years. Daniel's mouth had gone dry. He turned the name over in his memory, searching for a foothold, and found nothing. No headline, no mutual acquaintance, no reason a man like that should know Amara Whitfield, should walk across a ballroom for her like gravity itself had rerouted in her direction, except one memory surfaced, small and easy to have dismissed years ago. A trip Amara had taken before they'd even met, some volunteer program overseas before either of them had anything worth losing. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, in the early months when people still traded origin stories like currency. He'd barely listened. He'd been too busy talking about himself. He hadn't asked a single follow-up question. He remembered that now with a clarity that felt like punishment. Across the room, Amara was laughing. Actually, laughing. Warm and unguarded. Her hand still resting in Kang Min Jae's like it had simply returned to a place it recognized. She hadn't so much as glanced toward Daniel. She didn't need to. Her indifference landed harder than any accusation could have. Daniel. Priya's voice had dropped to something colder now, something that sounded less like concern and more like the beginning of an interrogation. You know her. It wasn't a question. Daniel opened his mouth to deny it, to construct some smooth deflection the way he'd constructed every convenient story of his adult life. But nothing came out, because for the first time in 6 years, he understood with total, sickening clarity that the story he'd built his entire new life on top of had a witness in the room, and that witness was no longer interested in keeping his secrets for him. Amara felt the room's attention like a physical weight, but for once in her life, she didn't shrink from it. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured to Min Jae, though her voice carried no real objection. "Every phone in this room is currently recording us." "Let them," he said. And there was something in his tone she remembered from 8 years ago. A stubbornness dressed up as calm. The particular arrogance of a man who decided something mattered more than the consequences of wanting it. "I spent 6 years being careful, Amara. I'm done being careful." She studied his face, searching for the boy she'd known on a relief mission in Busan, the one who'd carried water jugs alongside volunteers half his actual net worth, and never once mentioned his last name. She found him still in there, buried under a decade of boardrooms and inherited weight, but unmistakably present, in the small furrow of his brow, in the way his thumb traced absent circles against her knuckles, like he was making sure she was real. "You left," she said quietly. Not an accusation. A fact, laid on the table between them like evidence. "I did." He didn't flinch from it, didn't dress it up. "My father died, and 3 days later, I was expected to sit in rooms deciding the fate of 11,000 employees. I told myself disappearing was protecting you from an inheritance you never signed up for. I was wrong. I know that now. I've known it for years." Across the ballroom, Daniel Brooks stood frozen beside his wife, and Amara felt his stare land on her like a held breath. She didn't turn toward him. She'd spent 6 years training herself not to turn toward men who only looked at her when it was convenient for their own story. If you've ever watched someone rewrite history to make themselves the victim of a mess they created, you already know exactly how this feels. Comment below if you've been the forgotten chapter in someone else's success story. Nobody who's lived it will scroll past this without saying something. The Foundation's Gala coordinator appeared at Amara's elbow, flustered in the specific way people get when their carefully planned evening has gone gloriously, terrifyingly off script. "Ms. Whitfield, Mr. Kang, the board would love a photo if you're both amenable for the press release." "Later," Min-jae said, not unkindly but with the flat finality of a man unaccustomed to being told what came next in his own evenings. The coordinator retreated like a woman who'd just remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. "You're still doing that," Amara said, arching an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Deciding things for both of us and calling it protection." Something flickered across his face. Not offense, but recognition. The look of a man being handed an old mirror. "Old habits," he admitted. "I'm working on it." Behind them, near the bar, Priya had abandoned all pretense of subtlety and was openly staring, her wine untouched, her expression somewhere between fascination and dawning dread. She leaned toward Daniel. "You've gone white as a tablecloth. Start talking." "There's nothing to talk about," Daniel said, though his voice had lost its earlier polish, cracking slightly at the edges like old varnish. "Daniel." Priya's tone sharpened into something Amara recognized instantly. The sound of a woman doing arithmetic she didn't want to finish. "That woman knows you. I watched her face when you walked in. She recognized you before you ever looked her way." Daniel said nothing, which was, Amara thought with grim satisfaction from 30 feet away, its own kind of confession. Min-jae's security detail had fanned out at a discreet distance, close enough to matter, far enough to preserve the illusion of privacy in a room built entirely on the absence of it. A photographer's flash went off somewhere to their left, and Min-jae's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't come here to make a scene," he said to Amara. "Could have fooled me," she said. And for the first time all night, she smiled. Small, real, unguarded in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be around a man in years. "I came," he corrected, "because I read your name on the donor list and understood finally that I'd rather be the man who embarrasses himself in public than the man who lets you walk out of a room a second time without knowing the truth." The words landed harder than the kiss had. Amara felt them settle somewhere behind her ribs, old scar tissue reopening, not with pain, but with something closer to relief, the specific ache of a wound finally being tended to instead of ignored. "What truth?" she asked. Min-jae glanced once, briefly, toward Daniel across the room, a look that carried no anger, only the cool assessment of a man cataloging an obstacle he'd already decided didn't concern him. "The one your ex-boyfriend over there is currently praying I don't say out loud." Amara followed the direction of Min-jae's glance. And for the first time all evening, she let herself look directly at Daniel. He hadn't moved. He stood beside Priya like a man who'd forgotten how his own legs worked, his jaw tight, his eyes doing that thing she remembered from years ago. The frantic calculation of a man trying to figure out how much damage control a room required before he'd even identified the leak. He doesn't know anything, Amara said, turning back to Minjay. There's nothing to know. You and I happened before him. It's not some secret I owe him access to. I'm not talking about Busan, Minjay said quietly. I'm talking about what happened after. Something cold moved through Amara's chest. After what? Minjay hesitated. A rare thing for a man who'd spent a decade making decisions worth more than most countries' GDPs without blinking. 6 years ago, when your nonprofit almost collapsed in its first year, the anonymous donor who covered the shortfall so the clinics in Nairobi didn't have to close. Amara went very still. That was anonymous. I know. I made sure of it. His voice had dropped, quieter now, meant only for her. I'd read about what you were building. I couldn't reach out. Not without reopening a door I'd told myself I didn't have the right to open again. So I did the only thing that felt honest. I made sure the work survived, even if I couldn't be part of it. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fall away. String quartet and gossip and clinking glass reduced to background static. Amara had spent 3 sleepless weeks that year convinced her life's work was about to fold, had wept once, privately, in her car outside a bank that had just denied her 3rd loan application. And then, inexplicably, salvation had arrived through a donor who never signed a name, never asked for a report, never wanted anything back. She had thanked God. She had thanked luck. She had never once considered thanking him. You've been watching me for 6 years, she said slowly, and you never said a word. I told myself it was enough to know you were okay. He met her eyes. I was lying to myself. It's never been enough. I just didn't have the courage to admit that until tonight. Across the room, the whispers had reached a fever pitch. Amara could feel dozens of conversations rearranging themselves around the new information rippling through the crowd. Kang Min Jae, funder of the mysterious anonymous grant everyone in the nonprofit world had speculated about for years, apparently in love with the woman who'd received it. It was, she had to admit, even in the middle of her own shock, an excellent story. The kind that made front pages. The kind that made Daniel's investors very, very nervous. She glanced toward him again and watched 2 men in expensive suits detach themselves from a nearby conversation to intercept him. Their expressions polite, but their body language unmistakably that of people recalculating a relationship. One of them she recognized, vaguely from headlines, as a principal at the venture fund that had backed Daniel's last 3 rounds. Daniel? The man said, his voice pitched for civility, but carrying easily in the sudden hush around them. You didn't mention you had a personal connection to Mr. Kang's circle. That would have been useful information before we closed the Series C. I don't, Daniel said, too quickly, too defensively. I don't know him at all. Interesting, the investor said, glancing toward Amara with new appraisal. Because it looks like he knows someone very close to you. Priya's hand had gone still on Daniel's arm. When she spoke, her voice had lost every trace of its earlier warmth. Who is she, Daniel? And don't tell me you don't know. I've been your wife for 2 years. I know what your face looks like when you're lying, and right now it looks like that. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. The silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. Amara watched from across the room, and for the first time since she'd stepped through the Gala's doors that evening, she felt something unclench in her chest. Not triumph exactly, but its quieter cousin. The particular relief of watching a man's carefully built story begin, finally, to buckle under the weight of everything he'd left out of it. You should go talk to your wife, she said to Min Jae, nodding faintly toward the unfolding scene, though I suspect the conversation's already started without either of us. Later, Min Jae said. Right now, there's something I came here to ask you, and I'm not leaving this ballroom without an answer. Amara felt her pulse pick up despite herself. Ask me what? Min Jae reached into his jacket and withdrew something small. Not a ring. She registered with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, but a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases like it had traveled in that pocket for longer than tonight. 8 years ago, the morning I left Busan, I wrote you a letter, he said. I never sent it. I told myself it was because the timing was wrong, that my father's funeral and the board takeover didn't leave room for anything as small as an apology. The truth is simpler and less flattering. I was a coward. I thought if I explained myself, you'd ask me to choose you over the company. And I was terrified I'd say yes and destroy everything my father built in the process. He held the paper out to her. I've carried this letter through 4 continents and 11 years of pretending I'd moved past you. I'm done pretending. Amara didn't take it immediately. Her hands felt strangely unsteady for a woman who'd spent the last 6 years learning not to shake in rooms full of powerful men asking for things. Why now? She asked. Why tonight? In front of 300 strangers with cameras? Instead of literally any other moment in the past 6 years? Because I saw your name on a donor list and understood I'd run out of moments, Min Jae said simply. I've spent a decade telling myself there'd be a better time, a safer time, a time when the timing finally made sense. There is no better time, Amara. There's only the time you're brave enough to use. Behind them, the scene around Daniel had escalated. Priya's voice, no longer bothering with discretion, carried clearly across the nearby tables. 6 years, Daniel. 6 years of your humble beginning story, and you never once mentioned a woman you apparently left standing in an empty apartment. Was I ever going to hear about her, or was I just supposed to find out at a gala? It's not what it looks like, Daniel said, and even from a distance, Amara could hear how hollow the sentence sounded, a phrase deployed so many times in his life it had worn smooth like a stone in a river, meaningless from overuse. It's exactly what it looks like, Priya snapped back. You erased her. And judging by the way, half this room is now looking at you like you're something they scraped off a shoe. I'm starting to think erasing her wasn't even the worst thing you did. If you've ever caught someone rewriting their own history to hide the people they hurt along the way, comment, seen it below. This room is about to learn exactly how far Daniel's rewriting really went. And trust me, you don't want to look away now. Amara finally took the letter from Min Jae's hand, feeling the worn paper against her fingers. A physical weight of 8 years' silence finally handed over. I'm not going to read this standing in a ballroom, she said. I wasn't expecting you to. A faint smile tugged at his mouth, the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen from him all night. I was hoping you'd read it somewhere quieter. With me, if you're willing. There's a terrace through those doors that I'm told has an excellent view and considerably fewer photographers. Amara glanced past him, toward the terrace doors standing open to the night air, then back toward the chaos still unfolding around Daniel and Priya, the investors murmuring, the studio head already half turned toward the exit, the slow, satisfying collapse of a carefully constructed reputation happening in real time under crystal chandeliers. She thought about the version of herself who'd walked into this ballroom 2 hours ago, expecting nothing more than mediocre canapes and polite small talk about grant funding. That woman hadn't known a letter existed, hadn't known the anonymous donor who'd saved her clinics had a face and a name and a decade of silence he was finally ready to break. Fine, she said, but you're buying me a drink first, a real one, something that costs more than my rent. Done, Min Jae said, offering his arm. Though I should warn you, at this particular bar, that's a fairly low bar to clear. As they turned toward the terrace, Amara caught one last glimpse of Daniel over her shoulder. Pale, cornered, surrounded by the wreckage of a story he'd never expected to be cross-examined. She felt no pity, only the quiet, unmistakable satisfaction of watching 6 years of silence finally speak for itself. The terrace air was cooler than the ballroom, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Amara held the letter in both hands like it might dissolve if she gripped it too hard, and for a moment, she simply stood at the railing, looking out over the city lights instead of unfolding it. You can take your time, Min Jae said, standing a respectful distance away, though his eyes never left her. I know. She smiled faintly. I'm just deciding if I'm ready to be 8 years younger for the next 5 minutes. She unfolded the paper. Amara, by the time you read this, I'll already be gone. And I know that makes me exactly the kind of man I promised you I wasn't. My father is dead. The company needs an heir, and apparently grief doesn't excuse you from board meetings. I keep telling myself I'm protecting you from a life you never asked for. The security details, the arranged expectations, the version of me that has to exist now, whether I want him to or not. But I think the truth is smaller and worse than that. I'm afraid that if I ask you to stay, you'll say yes. And I won't be brave enough to build a life around someone I actually love instead of a company I only inherited. I'm sorry. I hope you build something extraordinary. I suspect you will, with or without me. Especially without me. Minjae Amara read it twice. The paper had gone slightly soft at the fold lines, evidence of a decade of being carried and reconsidered and, apparently, never sent. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, though her voice came out steadier than she expected. You called yourself a coward twice in one letter. I was being generous the first time. She let out a laugh that came out half a sob, pressing the back of her hand briefly to her mouth. 8 years, Minjae. I built an entire life thinking I wasn't worth an explanation. Do you understand what that does to a person? I dated men after you and measured every single one of them against a silence. That's an impossible standard to hold anyone to. I know. He didn't flinch from it, didn't offer an excuse dressed up as comfort. I don't expect this letter to undo 8 years. I only wanted you to finally have the truth, whatever you decide to do with it. If you've ever built a wall around your heart because someone left without explaining why, you already understand exactly what Amara is feeling right now. Drop a comment if silence has ever cost you more than the truth ever could. This story only gets heavier from here, so don't look away yet. Inside, the ballroom had shifted into something closer to a spectacle than a gala. Amara could see it through the tall windows, even from the terrace. A loose crowd gathered near the bar, Priya's raised voice occasionally cutting through the music. Daniel's face the particular shade of gray reserved for men watching their own narrative dismantled in real time. Your ex-boyfriend appears to be having a difficult evening, Minjae observed, following her gaze. He's not my ex-boyfriend. He's my ex-mistake. Amara folded the letter carefully and slid it into the small clutch at her wrist. I spent years thinking I did something wrong, that I wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't polished enough, wasn't whatever version of a partner he suddenly needed once money entered the picture. It took me a long time to understand that leaving without a word isn't a referendum on the person left behind. It's just a report card on the person who left. That's remarkably generous of you. It's not generosity, it's boundaries. She met his eyes. Which is also why I need you to understand something before this goes any further. I don't need rescuing Minjae. Not financially, not socially, not from an ex-boyfriend having a public meltdown 30 feet from us. I built my life without you. I'll keep building it whether you're in it or not. I'm not here to rescue you. His voice was quiet, certain. I learned that lesson the hard way, watching you handle a room full of billionaires and politicians tonight without needing a single one of them. I'm here because I don't want to spend another 8 years being a coward about the fact that I never stopped loving you. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began, soft and unhurried, dotting the stone terrace around them. Neither of them moved to go inside. That's a very expensive confession to make in front of 300 witnesses, Amara said. I told you. A small, genuine smile broke across his face, the first one all night that looked entirely unguarded. I'm done being careful. Inside the ballroom, the confrontation had reached its breaking point. Amara could see it clearly through the rain-streaked glass. The investor stepping back from Daniel with the particular finality of a man closing a laptop on a bad deal. The studio head already gathering his coat. Priya standing alone now, her wine glass abandoned on a passing tray. Her expression no longer confused but coldly, finally decided. I think your wife just made up her mind about something, Minjae said gently. She's not my problem to manage anymore, Amara said, and meant it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. She watched through the glass as Priya said something short and sharp to Daniel, then turned and walked toward the coat check without looking back once. Daniel didn't follow her. He simply stood there, alone in the middle of the ballroom he'd walked into 3 hours earlier, believing it belonged to him, watching his carefully built evening dissolve into something he'd have no comfortable way of explaining tomorrow. Amara felt no urge to go comfort him. That particular debt had been settled the day he left a note where a conversation should have been. I owe you an actual answer, she said, turning back to Minjae. Not to the letter. To the other question. The one you came here to ask. I haven't asked it yet. You didn't have to. It's written all over your face. She studied him. The careful, powerful, occasionally cowardly man who'd loved her enough 8 years ago to fund her survival anonymously rather than risk asking for anything in return. You want to know if there's still room, After everything, after the silence, and the letter you never sent, and the anonymous checks. And tonight, is there? Amara let the question sit for a moment, savoring the rare pleasure of making a billionaire wait for an answer. There's room, she said finally. But it comes with terms. No more disappearing to protect me from decisions I never asked you to make on my behalf. No more anonymous rescues instead of honest conversations. If you want back into my life, you do it in daylight, with your name attached, prepared for exactly the kind of scrutiny you got a small taste of tonight. I can live with scrutiny, Minjay said. I spent a decade avoiding it and found out it doesn't actually make a person happier, just lonelier, with better security. Amara laughed, a real laugh this time, unguarded, the sound cutting cleanly through the soft patter of rain. All right, Kang Min Jae. Daylight then. Starting tomorrow. He reached for her hand again, this time without an audience of 300 to perform for, and the gesture felt entirely different. Quieter, truer, a promise instead of a spectacle. Behind the glass, Daniel finally noticed them on the terrace. Amara watched him watch her, watched the specific expression of a man realizing far too late that the life he'd walked away from had not spent the intervening years waiting for him to reconsider. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let him see that she wasn't angry, wasn't triumphant, wasn't anything but entirely, finally free of him. Then she turned back to Minjay and didn't look toward the ballroom again. By morning, the story would be everywhere. Gossip columns, finance blogs, a dozen breathless headlines about the reclusive billionaire and the nonprofit founder he'd apparently loved in secret for years. Daniel's carefully rehearsed origin story would unravel in the retelling, investors quietly distancing themselves from a man whose foundation, it turned out, had been built on more omissions than anyone had realized. Amara's clinics, meanwhile, would receive more unsolicited donor interest in 1 week than they had in the previous 3 years combined. Her decade of unglamorous, unpaid, relentless work finally seen by a world that had spent 6 years calling her nobody. She hadn't asked for any of it, but she'd take it, not as revenge, though it certainly felt like justice, but as proof of something she'd known quietly all along, that the work outlasts the men who leave, that patience is its own kind of power, and that the truth, however long it's buried, has a stubborn habit of finding its way back into the room. If you believe silence should never get the last word, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments who you were rooting for tonight. Only the Daniels of the world skip this part.